Hello, it's Miss Amber here with your English 12A live lesson for today. We have a lot to go through today because we're working on the Canterbury Tales. We're moving on from Gawain and the Green Knight from last time and still talking about things that were written a little later in Middle English. So let me just get started sharing my screen and we'll get going from there. Okay, so I'm going to start off here on slide number 5. And they basically give you the history of the Canterbury location so you can understand why it's so important and why the Canterbury Tales is actually set there. So the long story short is that the Catholic Church was very powerful during medieval times. We went over that in our previous lessons. The Catholic Church controlled a lot of England's wealth and land. They were basically in charge of some important parts of the country along with the crown. So basically at this time, the king at the time, Henry II, was not happy with the church controlling so much. And he wanted to create a law where the clergy or people who were in the church, whenever they broke a law or broke rules, they could be tried by people in his court instead of it being handled internally by the church. So pretty much a slot or a job for Archbishop being the head of the Canterbury Cathedral opened up. And he specifically put someone that he knew there, Thomas à Becket, so that he could have someone in the church that would back him. Pretty much it went how you think it would go. He put Thomas à Becket in charge of this particular cathedral. And then when he needed Thomas à Becket to back him on having lawbreakers from the church tried by his court, Thomas à Becket was like, no, I actually don't believe in that. I actually don't support that. So basically, they bumped heads for a while. Thomas à Becket had backed him on some other stuff politically before. So he had reason to believe that Thomas à Becket would back him, but then it didn't happen. So moving on to the next slide, they pretty much bumped heads about that. And at some point, he was charged, Thomas à Becket was charged some pretty heinous stuff by the king, who wanted to get him out to try to get someone else in that would actually do what he wanted. And basically, Becket fled to France and stayed there for 6 years. And this was in 1164. So in 1170, Becket and the king reconciled and he was able to come back to his job. But Becket kept siding with the Catholic Church, which made the king angry. And at some point, he was venting to his knights about how frustrated he was with Becket and how much he wished that he could replace Becket and that Becket wasn't in his position. And those knights took that as a command to go and kill Becket. So what they did was showed up in Canterbury at the Canterbury Cathedral and basically said, hey, our king has some people that you've excommunicated because they didn't line up with what you and your church wanted. So we need you to absolve these people who have been excommunicated that are part of our court. And if you don't, we're going to kill you. So Becket was like, no, I'm not going to do that, because he basically had been disagreeing with the king forever. And since they made up, he pretty much figured he wouldn't have to do anything. But the knights killed him. They actually murdered him in response to him not reinstating people that had been kicked out. And that murder was pretty big in England at the time. Thomas à Becket was considered law-abiding. He was considered important to the church and an upstanding member of the clergy. So the reaction was pretty bad. Like, oh man, you killed this dude just because he doesn't agree with what you wanted politically. And there was a lot of talk about it. You have to also remember that this is after the Peasants' Revolt and some other stuff, where it was clear that people were unhappy with the class system at the time. And also, this was right before the Black Death as well. So just the church had a lot of power. They were considered favorable and good by a lot of the people in the country. So just killing a member of the church really actually turned the opinion of Henry II kind of bad in other people's eyes. So not just peasants or people on the lower class, but also upper class people. You can't just show up and kill people who aren't doing what you want, you know? So Henry II ended up changing a law that required clergy to be tried in his courts. He like reversed it. And also because Becket had been murdered for his strong beliefs and loyalty to the church, the king declared Becket a martyr. So he was allowed to be buried at the cathedral. And because he was laid to rest there or buried in honor of protecting the church's interests against the crown, people began to visit his grave and treat it like a holy site. And people started reporting miracles happening at Becket's tomb, and he was declared a saint. So basically, it became a pilgrimage location for people who wanted to seek out miracles or to change their fortune or, you know, pray to have a change in their life. And all of this happened before the author of the Canterbury Tales' time. So about 200 years before. So all of this is the background of why Canterbury was considered a holy place. So there was a strong legend, you know, 200 years is a long time by the time that Chaucer wrote this. And that's basically the legend of Canterbury and why it was considered an important place for people to go. The reason why this is important is because the Canterbury Tales is basically about a group of people who are traveling to Canterbury to see the site and to have their fortunes changed and things like that. So here, starting on slide 10, we get more information about Geoffrey Chaucer, who's the person who wrote the Canterbury Tales. So the long and short of his background is that he was a public servant. So he served kings, lords, he serviced in a war. It says here he was a soldier, an esquire of the king's household, a diplomat, a tax official, a justice of the peace, a member of parliament, a forest official, and obviously a poet, since he wrote this. So because he took all of these public jobs, they were basically the equivalent of government jobs at the time. There's a strong record of who he was and what it is that he did while he was alive. Yeah, so he came from a middle-class family, and because he jumped around and did all these jobs, he pretty much had a good idea of the different perspectives of people who were in British society at the time. Higher class and lower class, he worked all over the place, which was unusual from someone that came from even just a merchant family that was in the middle class. He was also alive during the Black Death plague. So he got to see a whole lot of what people considered to be important events at the time. He was a silent member of the community. He knew what was important to the rich and the poor. And he had a lot of perspective, which helps because the story of the Canterbury Tales is a lot about different people from different classes, pretty much. He wrote the story in Middle English, and that was a little unusual too, because he could also speak Latin, French, and Italian. And he spoke and wrote in these languages. It wasn't just speaking. So it's kind of a statement that he wrote this in Middle English instead of more popular languages that he knew at the time. Also, what we know is that he was actually buried near nobility at the Westminster Abbey. So that's a part of what we know about his life. He was technically born as a commoner. Even though he was middle class, he wasn't royalty or nobility, but he ended up being buried next to nobility because of the war he served in, the different positions he was in, the way that he helped. He served the king directly. And then On top of that, we know that his work was popular. I want to, let's see, which slide is that on? Nope, not this one. Nope, not this one. Okay. So we know that his works were popular pretty much because one, the Black Death or the Black Plague, the bubonic plague, was spreading at the time. People were not hopeful about being able to recover because England lost about 1/3, somewhere between 1/3 to 1/2 of its population. So that was crazy. And there was a shortage of farm labor, that kind of stuff. And it was just tumultuous times. It was not a good time for people. People were not living well. There were issues with England being able to find people to work the land because so many people had died. And Chaucer wrote this story to be sort of lighthearted and to give people something to look forward to and enjoy, and to not focus so much on the negative, but on what we can learn from people in their different stations in life. And this book was very popular. There are so many copies of the Canterbury Tales that are available, and that's how we know it was popular. Back then, books were printed, or books back then, books weren't quite printed yet. So his book came out basically before the printing press, but not too far before. So not only was it printed in the 1400s because it was so popular, but even before then, when people would copy books by hand, like word for word by hand on paper, there were still a lot of handwritten copies of this book. So we knew that it was popular if people were demanding to have copies of it. Now, part of what made his story popular was that he took a lot of different people from different stands in life and threw them together in a story. So the type of story that he wrote was estate satire, and this gets mentioned a little later in the lesson. But what's most important is there are people from all different classes in his story, and he portrays different traits and different types of people from all different classes. So there's a little section here on Middle English, just as a refresher. If you remember from the history of the English language lesson, that's another live lesson that you can look up if you need. The long story short is that at first, the British were ruled by Romans for a while. And this is when Old English started to form, when the Romans left, and England was taken over by people from basically the Germanic states. So we had the Anglos, the Saxons, the Jutes, the Danes. Those groups came in, and Old English came from those groups. This is when Beowulf was written. Now, after this, the Vikings came in and chased them out. And that's when Middle English began to form, after the Vikings invaded England. But it completed forming after the French defeated the English. So pretty much the Vikings invaded England and took over some part of that. Middle English started forming. There was a section of England that was still ruled by an English ruler. He promised someone in France that if they helped them fight off the Vikings from the eastern part of England, that they would be able to rule. The guy that promised that to the French king or the Norman king died before he could complete that deal. And the next person who became the king of England was like, yeah, no, I'm not giving up my land to you. So the French, the Norman French and the English fought after that. And the French won. So they settled in the eastern part of England, and eventually chased off some of the Vikings as well. So France ruled over parts of England for a while. And that's when Middle English formed solidly. That's where we get all of the French words that were introduced into English. So Middle English is the version of English that has so much and a lot of influence from the French, but a little bit of background from the Vikings too. So most authors at the time that Chaucer wrote this wrote in French because that was the favorite language at the time, or Latin but Chaucer wrote in English, in Middle English, so that regular everyday people could read his work. French was considered the language of the nobility since, royalty from Norman France moved in after the battles. But he wrote in Middle English anyway because he wanted everyone to be able to read it. He wanted your average person to be able to read his story. So this is the slide where they go over stories were passed down orally, but books were copied by hand, and those were a luxury. So unless your story was important, people wouldn't be copying it. But there are so many original manuscripts of the Canterbury Tales. You can tell that it was important, that people liked it no matter what class they were in. There's so many copies. And the first printed version, when the printing press finally arrived in England, was published in 1476. So then we get into the structure of the Canterbury Tales. So the long story short here is that the Canterbury Tales is a story within a story. That's pretty much how it works. So they give you the definition of that. That is a frame story. A frame story here is a story within a story. That's literally the definition right here. So the Canterbury Tales introduces the reader to a bunch of characters in the general prologue. So, a prologue is what goes at the beginning of the story to give you information. So it gives you an introduction to the story and how it's being told. Basically, what happens is that they give you a list of all of these people who are involved in the story, and they're all going to tell stories in this story. So the basic frame, and they're going to go into this a little bit later, is that there's a group of people who are they're doing a pilgrimage to Canterbury. That's where the history comes in. They're going to Canterbury because that's where people do to seek out miracles and changes of fortune and to be forgiven for sins. And there is a bartender that basically says, hey, we should, since this trip is long and it's going to take a long time, we should hold a contest and whoever can tell the best story wins. And that's how we get the setup for all of the stories that everyone is going to tell. Now here, they tell you information about the structure. All of Chaucer's poetic work was in rhymed verse. He wrote the Canterbury Tales in rhyming couplets, which means the last word of both lines in the couplet rhyme with each other. It says his stanzas vary in line length, and the beats per line also vary from one tale to another. So every person who tells a story has their own style, but everything is written in couplets, where the last word of every the last word in both lines of a couplet rhyme. So basically at the time, people were writing with 4 stressed syllables per line, and he did something different. He wrote with 5. Most of his rhymes have been exact rhymes based on how things were pronounced at the time. So that will help give you a clue while you're reading of how you should pronounce things. These are not near rhymes or slant rhymes. These are supposed to be close to exact rhymes based on how people pronounce things back then. It does say that in some cases he used alternate pronunciations for words. And then it says, for example, he used the word again to rhyme with rain and with hen. So he did both. And the selections are written in modern English so that you can better understand. So they're not going to make you read through the Middle English because it's kind of hard to do. They're going to give you the modern English versions of these. Oh, did I skip over something? Oh, yes. Okay. So this slide just says what I have already said. I just ended up skipping over it by accident. So they tell you about the host. The host name is Harry Bailey, and he suggests a storytelling competition for everyone who's there. It seems like Chaucer, the writer, is framing the story through Bailey. So he's basically the poem's narrator. Bailey is the person giving you information about everyone from the outside. And then when people tell their stories, you get their own voice. And he's the one who gives you, Harry Bailey is the one who gives you details of the pilgrims, how they look and how they act and all of that. So here we have symbols and themes. So they basically talk about the time of the year that the story was set, which is in spring. Spring is a symbol of new beginnings and fresh starts because it comes after winter. And they let you know that the pilgrims are getting a fresh start by going to Canterbury to get a blessing at the shrine of St. Thomas. Everyone's clothing, there's lots of descriptions of clothing. So their clothing is symbolic purpose. It tells you what class everybody is in. It tells you what their style is and gives you an idea of what kind of personality everybody has. The same way that you can look at certain character designs in like movies and cartoons and give you an idea of what kind of personality the character has or what archetype they are, what type of character. Some of the themes that are in the Canterbury Tales are the importance of social companionship or strength in numbers. So not fighting something alone, being able to have a group of people to rely on. The pilgrims are on their way to a religious site. And even though they're going to a religious site, they seem more like a party, pretty much. It says here merrymakers, but it's like a party or people who are on vacation than looking for spiritual guidance. They take part in friendly debates, so they go back and forth about what they think about certain things. And some of them even drink alcohol. But the thing is, in the story, they don't stop to attend any Catholic masses or visit other shrines on the way. The most important thing here is that they are actually together, and them being together and sharing each other's company gives them more comfort than religious services. Now, there are themes here about like courtly love and corruption of the Catholic Church. He does have some of the stories talk about those things. And this is what makes it part of the estate genre that was popular at the time. So the estate satire genre is basically when you comment on all of the different classes. And part of what's important about the Canterbury Tales is that at the time, it was one of the only stories where you actually saw all three classes, the nobility, the merchants and commoners, and the peasants and serf class, all together in a story. In an estate satire genre, you see criticisms of all of those, not just one focus or two. You get to see the story criticize all three, things that are wrong with all three, their attitudes, their outlooks, what they get away with, what they don't get away with, all of those things. So I want you to keep this kind of stuff in mind while you're reading the story. Next is characterization. So if you remember from previous English classes, direct characterization is when you directly tell someone in your story, here's how someone feels or thinks. So for example, they give you down here, Dion grew increasingly mad about the umpire's call. So they tell you he's growing more angry. They say it directly. But if you're doing it indirectly, you're describing what the person does or says or reacts. And you're using that as a hint to figure out what the character is feeling. So the indirect example is Dion's face grew redder and redder, and he yelled, "Get glasses up, you're totally wrong." So based on what he says, you can tell he disagrees with the umpire's call. And the fact that his face is getting more and more red, you can tell he's getting amped up with some emotion, is obviously anger. He's shouting, his words all have exclamation points. You have to draw conclusions from reading about how the character is feeling or how they're reacting. And that also tells you about what type of person this is. If he's getting this angry over a wrong call, it tells you that he gets angry when he disagrees with what other people are doing. And you can use that information to predict how he might react later in a story if something pops up. So that's the point of characterization. Chaucer almost exclusively, and that means only, uses indirect characterization in the prologue. So there's a lot of him letting you come to your own conclusions about things, which makes sense at the time since people had their own stereotypes about people. There were just like rumors, groups, ideas from the time about the different classes. So he lets people, make their own judgment calls on the characters. It's a little harder for us because we, aren't living during that time. But corruption of the church, the greediness of rich people, um, poor people who are having issues with like being jealous of others and dealing with those are still things that are relatable today though, so you should be able to pick out some things. And then here they just talk about some of the specific words that he chooses to do indirect characterization. He doesn't just write that someone's fat, skinny, or that some people are good and some are or evil. He adds some extra descriptions of things. So for example, there was a merchant with a forking beard and motley dress. High on his horse he sat, upon his head a Flemish beaver hat, and on his feet daintily buckled boots. So they're telling you about how this person is dressed, how he's sitting. High on his horse, he said. So he's not slumped over, he's not bent over, he's not trying to converse with anyone or anything. He's sitting high, back straight, looking ahead, ignoring other people. He told of his opinions and pursuits in solemn tones and how he never lost. So he's boasting about what he's done. He does say in solemn tones though, so he's not super loud, but he is talking about what he's done. He gives us an actual subtle description of how people are behaving and what they look like, so that you can, like I said, draw your own conclusions on things. So they talk here about making inferences, since you have to draw your own conclusions. It's not just enough to notice the words, you have to actually think about what those traits mean about what type of person this is. When you're watching a cartoon, if it's a movie or a TV show, you can sort of look at characters and tell, oh, this is the hero because of the way that they're dressed and what they're saying, or this is the villain because he's lurking around in the shadows and he's plotting. Those are the sort of archetypes or types of characters that Chaucer references in this work. So, for example, with that merchant he was describing, he's got a well-trimmed beard, he's got expensive clothing, the hats, he's clearly wealthy, right? And the fact that he talks in solemn tones about what he's doing. Solemn is basically kind of like a serious, reverent voice. He speaks seriously. He expects people to listen to what he's saying. And there are other terms that he uses describing other characters. So they just want you to dive in, pay attention to the words he's using. Ask yourself, okay, looking at the words in this description, what do I think about this person? So they want you to take time and do that while you're reading. So here are other examples. They give you the miller as another example. The miller was a chap of 16 stone, a great stout fellow, big in brawn and bone. He did well out of them, for he could go and win the ram at any wrestling show. Broad, knotty, and short-shouldered, he would boast that he would heave any door off hinge and post or take a run and break it with his head. So they're talking about how big and strong he is, a great stout fellow with brawn and bone. He's talking about being able to heave or push a door off of his hinges or break it with his head. He's definitely a big guy. He's not afraid of moving around. He's muscular and intimidating. And then it says, he did well out of them, for he could go and win the ram at any wrestling show. And it also says that he boasts, right? Broad, knotty, and short shoulder, he would boast he could heave the door off any hinge. So it's not just what he can do, but he also boasts about what he can do. So he's aware of his strength. He knows how to use it, and he knows what he could do. So he's got to be not just strong, but proud, because proud people boast about the things that they do. He impresses other people by flaunting his strength. You don't just show up, at a party and you're like, yeah, I can run over there and break that door over my head. Like that's just really, that's a very random point of conversation. He's clearly Very proud of that. So just thinking about what type of person this Miller is, you're supposed to guess at what kind of story he might tell. Remember that the Canterbury Tales is this group of people getting together and telling stories while they're on a pilgrimage. So what you want to do is guess at what type of people these are, because they all get introduced in the prologue, and then guess about what type of story the people that you think they are might tell. So if he seems like a boastful person who's strong, and he knows that he's strong and he likes boasting, what kind of story do you think he'll tell? Sometimes in the Canterbury Tales, people tell stories that are the opposite of what you would think, but it's still important to take a look at how he described it. Chaucer described these characters, what he wanted you to think versus what's actually in the story. I want to note that the type of stories that they tell also add to what kind of people they are, but you have to actually read the stories they tell to find out. So on this slide, after all of this information, the background and everything, you finally get the excerpt from the general prologue. I'm not going to go over the excerpt, but you pretty much have everything that you need to know about the story. They go over what reading the Canterbury Tales is like a little later here on slide 28. So they talk about some of the things that he included. And they talk about didactic tales. So didactic tales, the word didactic means to tell people what to do. Diegesis is shares a root word with this, and diegesis is basically when you give a straightforward explanation of what's happening in a story. This person went to the store. This person said this. This person was angry about this. It's the raw parts of a story without any kind of detail. So didactic tales are tales that instruct you in that plain sort of way. So they're trying to tell you what to do and give you instructions within a story. So a major sign that some of the tales are didactic is that they include anecdotal examples. So some of the stories are passed off basically as, oh, well, let me tell a story that's based on a true story, or let me tell you this story that happened to my friend. So when you frame a story like that, when you start a story like that, the idea is to teach someone about something that actually happened in real life in hopes that they would actually do something. So they give you examples. The Pardoner's Tale and the Nun's Priest's Tale are both these sort of stories where these characters start off saying, well, I'm going to tell you a story about something that actually happened. And maybe you guys can learn something from it. That's a very big sign of a didactic tale. It's in the story to teach you something while you're reading it. Now, those types of stories, the examples here, are called exempla. And obviously, that's very close to the word example. So example stories is basically what these are. And exempla stories are didactic because they're trying to give you instructions. So they tell you here that exempla had a deep influence on medieval literature at the time. It was popular. And even though Chaucer includes didactic tales in his work, not all of those stories are didactic. So that gives you a hint that he was influenced by what was popular at the time, but he wasn't just copying what was popular at the time. There's a lot of his own commentary and stuff in this work. It says even the didactic tales in Chaucer's poem are not as heavy-handed as they might seem. At times, the behavior of certain characters contradicts the morals they wish to illustrate with their tales. For example, in the Pardoner's Tale, the didactic message against greed sharply contrasts the pardoner's own greed. This humorous contradiction lessens his tale's didactic tone. So if you've got a person who works for the church, who's greedy and money grubbing, and they tell you a story about how you should be less greedy, there's irony happening there. And it's supposed to be funny. You're supposed to go like, man, Why would anybody take him seriously? He's doing the same thing he's telling other people not to do. And even though when you read this, this is going to be, it's in Middle English, it's going to sound probably a little boring to you based on the stories that we tell today. But this has the same structure and some of the same storytelling methods that we use now, just in an older form. You have all these people together. All these people are telling short stories to people while they're on this trip. And you're supposed to look at the types of stories they tell and actually compare them to the person and see if they make sense. The pardoner, being a member of the church who's greedy, telling other people not to be greedy, is funny. You're like, man, I'm not about to listen to him. It was basically, the attitude that some people would have at the time. And then you'll also have people who read this and say, well, the pardoner's not a great guy, but his story was a good story and he is right. It's supposed to get people talking about how people behaved at that time, what they were like, what they did, and whether or not you can separate a good story from a bad person. So they give you a little information about the partner's tale and then give you that excerpt. They pretty much give you an overview here, a description of the partner's hair, what he looks like. His voice is likened to a goat's voice in here. And they tell you about the exemplum in his story, and he's trying to educate the audience. He talks about greed being the root of all evil, but he's also greedy. And then they give you the link to the excerpt so you can read it yourself. And then the nun's priest tale is another story. The nun's priest is mentioned in the prologue, but the narrator doesn't actually describe him. And part of the reason why is because nuns priests were so popular at the time. Everyone kind of had a picture of what they generally looked like at the time. They would have known that his job was to hear the confessions of nuns. And he's asked to tell a light and humorous story. So he tries to use like a hero style of narration, but he ends up kind of mocking it and making fun of it. So think of like the type of language that people used in Beowulf, that sort of elevated style. He tried to make fun of those kind of stories by using that sophisticated language to describe something silly. And he ends up telling a story about a fox attacking a chicken coop. And I think he also incorporates, yes, he uses the literary tradition of courtly love that we just learned about in the last lesson from Gawain and the Green Knight to enrich his mock heroic tale. So he basically makes fun of epic courtly love stories and heroic stories by telling a silly story that uses that kind of language. They give you an example before the excerpt. And I think that that's it. Yep, the last section is a focus on language. They give you some more words and parts of speech and definitions. So make sure that you take time to read the excerpts and compare it to the small examples and explanations that they give you. We know that Middle English is difficult. It's hard to get a handle on those and to be able to understand every single thing in the story, but they put it in modern English and they actually have excerpts to explain, oh, well, here's what's funny, here's what's ironic about it. But now that you understand the background of the Canterbury Tales, the religious site, some of the culture at the time, what type of person Chaucer was, you can have a little better appreciation for this one man being able to write about so many different types of characters from different classes using the information that he knew. Pretty much at the end of the day, these are all stories that are just meant to give you an idea of what working or living in the different classes was like and what the issues for these people were at the time in an entertaining way. The same way that we get movies and stories about what happens to people in everyday times here in this day and age. So hopefully you're getting the pattern here, which is that different people writing different things, just evolves over time. We're still writing similar, the same types of things that we've always written, just in different formats and stuff now. Alrighty, this is Miss Amber signing off. As a reminder, please get in contact with your mentor or advocate since we're in Count Month, and make sure that if you need help with understanding any of these excerpts beyond just this rough summary of the lesson, please contact the English department. You can email us at english@atsedu.net, or you can ask your advocate or mentor. Other reminders, the English concept summaries will give you grammar and story information. I'm also updating them with some of the specifics of what I go over in these live lessons, just in case you need a breakdown of the history behind any of the things that we're reading. And I think that's about it. So this is Miss Amber signing off, and good luck with your English class.